And also throughout the discussion here on Git, if there's any sort of clarification or a little bit more information on one of my slides, please just interrupt me during the talk and ask for that if it's something really quick. For longer topics, we'll have those at the end or over lunch. All right, so I wanted to start off with the purpose of the talk here. My goal is not to say we're switching to Git or to say, here's what we need to do. What I want to do is start off with a little bit of context and history to understand how we got to where we are today. Figure out what we can do in the short term to make better use of the Git integration that we do already have, and make sure that it is supported and usable. And then my goal is to come to an understanding of what questions we have to answer if we are going to ask the question, are we going to switch our source of truth repository to Git or not? So, brief history. The project was an early pioneer of using revision control, CVS, from the very beginning. Started migrating from CVS version in 2012, finished the migration in 2012. 2008, the source tree was merged over, and then doc and ports later on. We had a fairly long run of using Perforce as an experimental repository for managing work-in-progress changes and development on multiple projects at the same time that weren't ready to go into head. That use is subsided a few years ago, and very recently the Perforce server was shut down as Perforce stopped supporting FreeBSD as a platform. And I think it was very useful for us in the beginning, but for the last several years, Perforce hasn't really played a part. Then we also have had Mercurial and Git mirrors more recently. So the Git mirror has been running since 2011 and in use by several people. So we actually have multiple Subversion repositories in the project. The public-facing one is svn.freebsd.org. There's an internal repository that's synced into that one, and that's relevant when we look at what happens with the Git the Git conversion today. So a commit makes it into the official source of truth repository, repo.freebsd.org, gets synced into the Subversion repository, gets converted two different ways into a Git repository that's internal. We used to expose it. Publicly. I think it was git-beta.freebsd.org. It's no longer publicly accessible. It's an internal repository that receives the Subversion to Git conversion, and then from there it's pushed out to GitHub, and it could go to any other kind of Git hosting location from there. And the reason we have two different views of it is there's at least two different ways that you can take a Subversion repository and make it into a Git view. Git internally has Subversion support, Git SVN, and this allows you to work in the Git repository and then push the changes back into Subversion Git SVN decommit. And I know some folks in the community are using that. It ends up with a slightly different sort of metadata and commit message format from SVN to Git, which operates at kind of a repository level, but the content is exactly the same either way. And so what I wanted to show here is just, that then once changes get into GitHub, we have downstream consumers in GitHub or elsewhere who can fork or take our project, make their own derived changes. And then from there, we end up today bringing changes back from the Git world through a committer. So the blob in green here is a FreeBSD committer who has SVN commit access to our actual repository, and they can take changes from the Git world, either from a pull request or from a downstream fork, can cherry pick individual changes out of the downstream Git view and then loop them through and get them into Subversion. And there's several developers in the FreeBSD community who have participated in this process already. So in the FreeBSD world, we have lots and lots and lots of complaints about Git. I've listed some of them here. PHK had a great, what I've called a missive, that titled "Git is not a version control system," and goes through a whole bunch of points. Personally, I don't find the argument Git is not a version control system particularly persuasive. I think it's sort of a semantic game in my view to be able to limit the scope of what it's referring to. It is absolutely the case that Git can be used in a lot of different ways, and in a lot of ways it's kind of a toolkit that you can use as part of something larger. So often, when I talk about the way FreeBSD might use Git, I'm implicitly saying in the context of the way that most people use Git. And that's not necessarily as far as saying most people use Git. Most people conflate Git and GitHub and sort of think that it's it's sort of the same thing. And I'm not necessarily going that far, but something like whether or not you have a definitive repository, the source of truth. One of the arguments saying Git is not a revision control system is there's no source of truth. Well, I mean, I don't really find that a persuasive argument. You pick a source of truth. Repo.freebsd.org is the FreeBSD source of truth. If that was git repo.freebsd.org is the source of truth, well, it's exactly the same thing. Like we definitely will have a source of truth. That it's not really it's not a controversial point, I think. And then there's there's this SVN versus Git page has been around for a little while and goes through a bunch of myths and things, and some of them are true, some of them are less true today than they were before. I advise you to look at these if you want to see some reasons other people dislike Git. So this is from the SVN versus Git page that said, a myth, nobody uses Subversion anymore. This is false. And they go on to say, big projects, well-known projects like FreeBSD and LLVM still use Subversion. Is true. LLVM is in the final stages of switching to Git and migrating to GitHub. So pretty soon we will be the marquee Subversion using open source project. There's still a fair bit of Subversion being used, but I don't know that there's sort of other big marquee well-known open source projects that using it other than us in the at least looking forward. Alan looks a little bit confused. And then they also went on to say that almost half of the open source projects on whichever data set they were using are using Subversion still, and a little over a third are using Git. That was 2016. Then so I clicked on their link, and it takes you to this chart, which is the updated data. And so now 2/3 of the projects in the last 2 years, from 2016 to 2018, 2/3 of the projects in OpenHub's data is now using Git, 1/3 is on Subversion, and the others are all basically in the noise. Rod?
That's based on number of projects or size of projects?
This is based on number of projects. So it's OpenHub's data that they sort of like try and survey, the broadest set of open source repositories they have access to. So Mercurial, Bazaar, I think the light blue is Other, and CVS. They're all basically in the noise. As far as the open source projects that are accessible to them go, it's 2/3 Git, 1/3 Subversion. And people complain about Git's user interface and user experience. I'm not going to talk about that. It is absolutely bizarre, and there are legitimate complaints about it. It just is.
Even further than the picture you found. I can give you a better picture, but you can't put it up.
So I mean, I have no response to that. It just, yes, it is. I've learned to deal with it. You know, the vast majority of the open source world has learned to deal with it. I don't have a good answer beyond that.
It's actually got better somehow.
I mean, one of the interesting things to me is, personally, I think a lot of the underlying fundamentals of the way that Git operates make a lot of sense. The user interface and interface that's built on top of it is really kind of bizarre. People complain about repository size, saying, "Oh, Git's going to be huge. I don't want to have to keep the entire history of of the repository on my local machine. I don't have space for that." This was some data from checking out the Subversion repo a couple of days ago. 3.3 gigabytes for both the Subversion directory and the checked out working tree. Git was 3.9 gigabytes. I mean, it's 600 megabytes more. It's kind of a wash for disks today. I think it's not really a big deal. And the other thing that's really interesting is if you do have a Git checkout, you can make a whole bunch of work trees all accessing the same .git directory. So you'd have one copy of the actual repository on your laptop or whatever, and then individual working trees. So it's actually, if you're working on two different views of the repository at the same time, it's a size win with Git. And then, you know, I listed the times here. I mean, it was just network, the 872 seconds here versus 494 seconds. At the top. I mean, this is just my local, you know, the network traffic to my my desktop I tried it on. It's pretty much equivalent.
I think I have 5 different upstreams on my Git for FreeBSD alone, and it's really nice on the space savings on a laptop for, you know, all the different stuff I've got to deal with. So.
One of the other things that's nice about Git is that there are a lot of operations in a Git world that are much faster. So if you are switching between one branch and another, or are updating and there's no changes, Git it can be very, very quick at determining that it has nothing to do. As well as sort of very large updates. So if you have a tree and you haven't updated it in a very long time and then you update it, Git can be very, very fast for that compared to Subversion. There are cases where often I've observed, you know, if you're updating a week's worth of changes from head, it's maybe Subversion's a little bit faster, depending on network latency and whatnot. But generally speaking, Git is either as fast or much faster for the operations I've done. One big complaint about Git in the FreeBSD world is the lack of monotonically increasing version numbers. And this usually comes up because people say, there's been a security fix in some revision, 339.181. I have revision in 339.296. I have to change because the number is higher, right? That's kind of the use case for monotonically increasing version numbers. There are other reasons that's convenient. It's easier to wrap your head around a 6-digit number than a commit hash, but that's the primary one that people raise. But this was kind of a trick question because these are actually on different branches. So the change is not in there, and I don't use this to say this is not useful. My point in bringing this up is it's actually the tuple of the branch and the revision number that tell you whether you have a change or not. And I present that only to say, the requirement here is you want to be able to say, perhaps offline, without access to a repository, you want to say, do I have this change or not? That's the question we're really trying to answer. And so just saying I have a monotonically increasing version number isn't the requirement. It's being able to identify if a change is in or not. And so one of the things is Git can tell you basically the same information. You can say for a given branch, how many commits have happened on that branch. And so if you have that tuple of a branch and the number of commits that are on it, you can say, is the change in or not? On my desktop, it takes 3 seconds to answer that question. So it's faster than having it be an inherent fundamental property of the repository format. but it's still relatively quick. And we could, if we decided that monotonically increasing numbers are the way we want to continue to track this going forward, we could manufacture this as a pre-commit hook and add it as a note in the official repository if that's what we wanted to do.
I was going to say exactly that. And that's what, isn't that basically what the Git SVN does? I mean, how does that work? Because you get,
Well, so I mean, Git SVN has the original commit ID in the metadata, and so this is if we didn't have. In a world where we didn't have an upstream Git or an upstream Subversion repository that we're mirroring, could we answer this sort of question? So, I mean, Git SVN goes away in a world where we're...
okay, but you have a pre-commit hook that eventually gets the same monotonically increasing numbers.
It could.
Yeah, I think the goal
Makes pushes hard, though.
What?
It would make pushes harder, because you have to take the lock and nobody else can do anything while you're...
Yeah, there's some on that. There's some on that later on. Quick one.
That's true if you don't allow you to do crazy history writing anyway.
So,
but
can I make a point of order? If we start this conversation while Ed is trying to finish the conversation?
Yeah. So as I said at the beginning, let's if we have like points of clarification, please bring them up, and then broader topics we'll take on the end or over lunch.
Can you do the opposite, go from a Git hash and say, does this hash exist on this branch?
Yeah.
Yes. So with access to the repository, you can answer that question quite easily. You need to have
That's the crux of the issue, is whether you require the Git repo to be present to answer those questions.
Right.
And that means that source.tgz goes away. The usefulness of source.tgz goes away. And if that's a trade-off that we make, then that's a decision as part of this process.
So we can answer that question with this sort of thing if we stick this node in and then put this manufactured version number into the source.tgz. We could. Partial tree checkouts. This is a long time complaint about Git. I just want to quickly check out bin ls and fix the one bug that I've found. I can't do that. I'm not entirely sure you can do that in the Git world today. In the past, you couldn't check it out at all. It is possible now, as of very recent Git versions, to clone something and check out only a subset of the entire tree. I'm not sure if you can actually then push from that back upstream. I just don't know. But it used to be not possible at all. It seems some work is in progress for it. Another thing people have brought up is I want to clone a repository and I don't want all the history. I just want a quick, I'm going to build a version and I don't need everything. I just want to get a view of the tree as it exists today. That's been supported for quite a long time. You can ask for how many revisions back you want from the current. And I'm pretty sure that you can then commit from this as well.
Yes, you can.
One complaint is that Git allows you to make a mess of the history. You can do whatever you want, and Subversion doesn't. And I mean, that's not entirely true. Subversion by default allows you to change the commit message after something's been committed. We have in FreeBSD we have a pre-commit hook that doesn't allow you to do that. And I think personally I think that's the right policy. I think once something's committed, it should stay the way it is. And in the Git world, you can rebase, you can do git rebase-i locally and change the commit history, or change the history on your local repository as much as you want. But then for the source of truth definitive repository, if that was Git, we would just have a pre-commit hook that says you can't rewrite the history that is in the upstream project. And so as far as the history of the definitive repository goes, it would be exactly the same immutability. Some people dislike the fact that you can rewrite the history locally. Personally, I also don't find that to be a persuasive argument. I mean, I think you could do the same thing in Subversion by keeping a whole bunch of patch sets out and then applying them over and then committing them. Git makes it easy, and I think people dislike the fact that it's easy. But I mean, it's not making something possible that isn't otherwise possible.
The data is there, the metadata is gone. Local modification. So it is possible, with a lot of effort, to ferret that out. And I've had half of a blog post written for how you do that effort. But it's possible to get that get that local history, go back 3 revisions, because that's the version I know worked.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that is that's a good topic for that's a good open question for what a potential Git worldview looks like. Because my opinion on that sort of thing is, at the time that you can push changes into a repository of truth, the history should be completely self-contained. It should have all of the information needed to understand the full context of why that change went in. But I mean, that's a topic we can talk about over lunch or such. Ravi?
Just want to comment about the immutability of commit messages. So actually, one of the things that I really like about Perforce is that you can go back and after you submit something, you can't change the contents of the commit, but you can update the message. And I am 98% sure that if you know the proper incantation, you can actually get different versions of the commit message for a particular.
So you basically have versioned commit messages.
So.
Yeah.
Perforce seems to be able to version almost everything, which is really kind of neat. On occasion.
Could be interested how many times we get on the email list for, oh, I forgot to put this detail in the commitment.
Yeah, do that.
We can. That's a perfect bike shed topic for over lunch. Keywords: $FreeBSD. Git has no support. I don't like them personally. I kind of wish they went away. Git doesn't support them.
Couldn't that also be a pre-commit hook too?
We could have a pre-commit hook if we really wanted. I think a Git source of truth, that's something we would have to ask and say, can we just do without them? Git doesn't do very good at tracking renames, moves, and copies. It infers the operation you've done. So often, if you create a new trivial file that has 30 lines of header and 3 lines of content, Git will often infer that what you've actually done is copied some completely arbitrary file and made a small change to it. The interesting thing is that this has absolutely zero impact on what the state of the repository or the tree is. If you have a specific hash checked out in Git, it will absolutely guaranteed to be corresponding to what is expected in that hash. It's just if you do a Git log, it may look like the history isn't actually what happened. And I'm not aware of any work that's been going on to handle this in Git.
Just to comment on that, you can turn all the rename stuff on and off.
Right, but the point is entirely that I think is that all of that rename stuff is sort of, it's inferred and it's client side, right? It's after the fact it says, oh, I think you renamed this, as opposed to explicitly tracking, I ran git mv or git cp or even just cp.
Yeah. That's the nature of the beast. It doesn't actually track one revision to the next. Each tree is checked in as a discrete set, and it just tries to sort of guess as to how you got there.
I mean, this is something. If we really cared about this, we could propose some sort of Git note that tracks the explicit rename and then goes with the history if we really wanted. It could be done. I don't know that anyone else in the Git world cares. So. Complaints often been brought up. Git doesn't scale to extremely large repositories. Fortunately, we are not extremely large. Our.git is about the same size as the Linux.git, which is kind of the primary use case for it. So we should. It's interesting that our entire kernel plus the tool chain, a copy of Clang in there, plus all of the history. And the entire userland and C library and everything is about the same size as the Linux kernel, but it's at least it means that we shouldn't encounter problems that Linux people aren't going to also encounter. Binary artifacts not supported in Git because of the sort of inherent nature of a DVCS. don't think it matters for us. This is a complaint that people have brought up and something that we would have to resolve. In a Git world, you will always have to rebase your local changes to head, and then in order to push them into the repository of truth. And so there's a race window. If someone else gets ahead of you, you need to fetch that, rebase on top of those changes, and then push them in. I did a little analysis here of just sort of how time between commits over the past year, and anyone with a statistics background will tell me that this is sort of a completely useless analysis, because this isn't actually what you want to ask. It's not how often do commits happen together, but at an arbitrary point in time, what's the probability that there hasn't been a commit in some history, but within the last minute, within the last hour, or whatnot. I think the important thing is, though, that looking at our repository history, there's not a lot of times where people would actually trip over this.
I think this data shows that we would trip over this a lot, because in the 10-minute window, you have almost half of your.
So you have the same statistical fallacy that I did when I put this data together. If you pick an arbitrary 10-minute window when you're ready to commit, the probability that someone else has committed in the previous, in that 10-minute window, is very, very low.
And that's not how many commits are done by the same people serially.
So that's the other point, right? This misses the fact that a lot of times some of these very quick commits will actually be a series of someone who's using Git SVN decommit already and pushes 3 or 4 changes in that go in as a sequence, or you commit a change and then regenerate syscall.master or something like that. Those sorts of commits inherently are going to show up in that number as well.
Well, it's only merges to branches.
So that is a important point. So we already have this problem with Subversion today for stable branches. If you want to do an MFC and someone else has done the MFC already, you have to do the same sort of update and potentially resolve a conflict if there is one.
The only other thing I would say is our rebases will be painless. You'll just rebase master and be done with it. I also do work with GV, which is a project that uses changelog. We've had explain more about how we can't get rid of changelog, which means every time I have to rebase, I have to manually edit every single thing to fix the stupid changelog. So no, this is not an obstacle for us.
I mean, it is something that we would need to adapt to, but I think it would not be a significant concern. Brooks?
I would also comment that many workflows that you might pick up if you had Git would involve things like pull requests and merging through pull requests, where the rebase is something that the tools do for you. Or we could pick up mandatory testing, in which case, your commit has to go through this Git stage anyway.
So I have a problem with the word rebase here, because nothing requires that you rebase, merge the head. It's really merge or a rebase. And rebase is an advanced thing where you can
So
definitely the race for merging and pushing.
So that topic is in my questions we would need to is coming up, and that is an important question that we have to solve if we were going to move to a Git source of truth world. This sort of issue, I think, is inherent in our current model of a Subversion repo with a Git mirror. So getting to kind of where could we go from here, I tried to enumerate sort of all of the options, starting with the first one, which says we don't like Git, we really want to see it fail. We're gonna shut down the official or semi-official Git mirror that we have today. Someone else could continue to run one, but we're not going to support it. I don't think that's viable. We could continue with the Subversion repo as our definitive repo, and with a best effort Git mirror, which is basically what we have today. we could promote the Git mirror to be fully supported, to the extent that the project provides service level agreements, SLAs. We provide the same for the Git mirror. In other words, someone's monitoring it. If it goes down, it won't be, it'll be something other than a downstream person's emailing and saying, hey, this hasn't updated in 2 weeks, what's going on? We would actually have some monitoring tooling around it. We could switch to Git as the definitive repo, either with a Subversion mirror. GitHub can actually do that natively. It can let you use Subversion clients to access a GitHub hosted repo, or we could invent something ourselves, or we could just not have a Subversion access. And then something else. And also, I think at this point, it is probably not in our interests to spend a lot of effort trying to support interesting but extremely limited use VCS. So a lot of people conflate Git and GitHub, and I probably did a little bit in some of the talk so far. But really, it's a separate question, Git versus SVN, and something self-hosted versus GitHub or GitLab or whatever the case might be. I think that in a world where we have some sort of Git presence, it behooves us to have a presence on GitHub. For a lot of people, GitHub is where open source lives, and if someone's searching for a project, it's just we want to be seen in the same venue where everything else is. So no matter what happens, I think we're going to keep a GitHub presence there. Personally, I don't think it's in the project's interests to depend on third parties. I think there is a lot of value for us in an operating system project in being able to say we host our own infrastructure and we understand how things work and we do that. I mean, but it's an open question. There's a variety of different tools we could use to host a Git mirror or a Git repo.
You should put Garrett on that list too.
I don't like Garrett. I mean,
It's bigger than one person's personal preferences.
Sure. I mean, no. That is a valid open question, right? How would we host a self-hosted Git repo? A little bit of data. We have over 1,500 forks of FreeBSD on GitHub. I think Linux has something like 22,000 on Torvald's GitHub mirror. So point being, it is actually a fairly sizable, substantial number of people who have done something with FreeBSD on GitHub, including sort of downstreams, IX and such, are using that in a production capacity. We've not done an incredibly good job at addressing pull requests in the past. But I mean, we've been through 140 closed ones on our GitHub presence. Some of which have been closed because they're invalid. Many of them have been brought into FreeBSD through efforts of Warner and others. Basically loop through Subversion, as I mentioned before. There's 30 of them open still, and every once in a while, people get some interest and go through and try and find useful content in there to bring in. Very quick set of stats on Dragonfly. When Dragonfly split off from FreeBSD, they used Git for their repository hosting. And I present it sort of just as an example that you can do a FreeBSD scale project with a reasonable number of unique authors in a Git world.
Self-hosted on what? They self-hosted on Git?
So I think they're using Git's like built-in server.
It's hosted on DragonFlyBSD, and then they're a Git server.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it like Git over SVN?
Yeah. Yeah. and then they have a GitHub mirror from that as well. So where do we go from here? So I've sort of presented the two options. First option is we stick with Subversion as the source of truth as we have today. Put in place monitoring and SLAs and such around the Git mirror that we have. And one of the topics that's been brought up on our Git mirror in the past is the potential of the hashes changing. And I think we need to be very explicit to our downstreams about if or when that would happen. I suspect that we have one respin of all of the hashes in our future to correct some broken metadata from an earlier subversion to Git.
Catastrophe.
Yeah. So I think we would have to have that pain of spinning all the hashes once, and then from that point on, say, you know, we will do our best to never let that happen again. You know, there could be a legal challenge or something like that. There may be some reason we have to deal with it in the future, but we would, to the best of our ability, ensure that it would never happen again. And then if we go that way, one option, we stick with GitHub as the way that people access FreeBSD in a Git world. And to do that, I think we need to put some effort into formalizing the way we handle pull requests. You know, ensure that they're getting looked at in a timely manner and brought into FreeBSD or closed if they are invalid, make sure that they're actually getting closed. And then build some more integration around that. So one of the things we could do is if a pull request gets open, it could be that someone who's a FreeBSD committer who has a GitHub account can tag that PR somehow, and then magic happens in the back and it automatically gets mirrored over to Subversion and committed to the repository. We could also start hosting our own infrastructure, our own GitLab, GitHub, etc. Or sorry, GitLab or one of the other hosting tools. But a lot of the same questions still apply. We still need to make sure that we are handling pull requests on GitHub or deciding that we're not going to enclose them as soon as they come in with an explanation of our process or whatnot.
Just clarify. Linux doesn't, 12 doesn't accept pull requests.
Yeah, there's absolutely no requirement that we be on GitHub and accept pull requests. We could certainly just close, we could have them automatically close with, this is not our process, here's how you can submit a change to FreeBSD. One way or another, we need to tell contributors how they can interact with our project, and then actually handle resubmissions if we're going to, or just close them out of hand if we're not going to. Warner?
The way that we handled them in the past has been spotty, regardless of the technology to get them by.
And then other option is resolve all the kind of outstanding problems that we've had with our Subversion and Git dual worldview, make the Git repository the definitive one, and then just, we can decide if we want to have a Subversion access or not afterwards, and stand up all of the infrastructure to have access to our repository and figure out how all of the integration with existing things like Bugzilla and all of that starts or is handled. And there's sort of separate questions that can come out of that whole process about switching Bugzilla and all of that sort of thing. I mean, from my perspective, all of that is completely out of scope of any repository question. If we start tying so many different things into one into the same question, it's going to prevent us from ever being able to even ask that question. LLVM is finding this right now. LLVM is in the process of migrating from Subversion to Git, and people have started saying, well, should we shut down our Bugzilla and move everything to GitHub issues? And the kind of response has been, we're not even going to look at that question right now. We're going to stick with our everything else, just the repository migration at the beginning. It is noon. I have a few more topics.
Do 10 minutes.
I can go through this, I think, in 10 minutes, and then over lunch we can.
Have to defer questions.
Yeah, we can have the.
That's not fair. You can't throw these out there and then just.
I think that was the plan, actually.
Open questions. License on most of the Git servers, clients, etc. Mostly GPL. There are some MIT or other permissively licensed Git components in wonderful languages like Python, Java, JavaScript, or Go. But nothing that we could easily bring into the base system. So that's a question we have to figure out for FreeBSD. Could we accept a GPL VCS in the base system? Could we rely on ports? Is it okay to rely on someone adding GPL'd Git from ports to develop on FreeBSD? Open question. MFCs. The process for MFCs would be different in a Git first worldview, but I think it translates over fairly easily. Cherry picking would work just fine in this kind of model. There may be some tooling we have to develop and some process, but that's a pretty easy question. This is a big one that we'd have to resolve in a Git first world. Our vendor import process really doesn't map to the way Git wants things to work. And I think our vendor import process works quite well for us, so I don't want to just lose it. But that's an important question we have to resolve, is how would we do this in the Git world? And there's 3 different ways that Git has handled this over time. Git submodule has existed since the very early days of Git, and basically grafts in, or it checks out another Git repository underneath the main one that you're working on, and then updates it in sort of a semi-synchronized way. It often will involve a lot of manual futzing if you switch between different branches or things, you have to deal with that explicitly, which isn't particularly nice, and it doesn't really map to the way we want to do things. And I've found lots and lots of people discussing submodule and say, just don't use it. Git subtree, this was written by a friend of mine who was a Debian developer originally, and it grafts the history of one project into yours. So for example, if we have Clang, the contrib Clang directory would have a history, a mirror of all of the changes that came from the upstream Clang or LLVM projects repository grafted into ours. And you could see both of them. It would show up as a merge when we brought new changes in, and it could be squashed at the time you do the merge, which is equivalent to what we have today, or you could graft in the entire history of all of their other changes into our repository if you were so inclined. Peter?
One super quick comment. One of the things we've typically done with vendor imports is we've pulled in release blobs. If you're actually talking about tracking developer trees, that's a different kind of moving target thing, so that would need to be addressed as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, Git would allow us, or make it easier for us to track something other than released artifacts of vendor code. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to
it's just
track ours.
People need to be aware that it's different.
Yeah. And then subrepo is the latest iteration of the trio of tracking other repositories. And it's sort of, at least the way it's sold, it seems to be the holy grail of this. It supposedly will map very closely to what we do today, where we can bring in Clang, say, or LLVM, and it shows up as a single commit in our repository. But then you can also take the individual changes that we've made locally and push them back into the upstream project as individual commits. However, all of this is kind of work in progress. It's not production code yet, as far as I understand it. So it's something that we have to keep an eye on and figure out where it is at the time we're ready to ask that question. And then finally, how does a switch to Git affect all of our teams? So I've put some of the ones that I've thought of already, but there's a lot of open questions about just all the way different teams would interact with it. So Branching and tagging in release engineering, it should be the same as the way developers would operate on project branches or tag their own changes. We can map our current stable branch process into a Git branch quite easily. And then we can develop commit hooks for all of the same. If a head freeze, we can do commit hooks to accommodate it, and we can also add commit hooks for all of our other mentored. You need approved by mentor for a mentee, that sort of thing. Same way as we do with Subversion. For sec team, Git actually has a lot of very nice properties in that all of the changes that we would have for a security update could be pre-staged and tested and built and developed. And then at the time that we release that security advisory, that those commits are made public in the main repository, but they're exactly the same content that was used to develop or to build the binary patches and to test. Peter?
Or modulo the moving head things, so that would have to be.
Well, so in the case of security, security patches, I'm thinking specifically of our release branches, and so yeah. 11.2 P3 is, when we do P4, only sec team is going to commit to those.
Never mind, carry on.
And I think this is my final slide. Git is a product of the Linux community. It maps very well to that kind of model where you've got subsystem maintainers and then a whole bunch of people feeding changes to them and then people feeding changes into them. Subversion is a very good match with our very flat model. Everyone has their areas that they work on, but committers are we're all equal and we can all commit to any area of the tree that we're comfortable and competent to work in. It's a source of friction that we would have to overcome, I think, or maybe not even a source of friction, but it's just, it is something that, the Git's worldview kind of maps to the Linux community's worldview. And then finally, if we did work in this hybrid model where we've got the Subversion repository and then the Git downstream, what does it mean to be a committer? For example, if we do have a fully supported Git workflow and people can submit pull requests and then a committer could tag them and have them automatically brought into Subversion, and we end up with a large set of developers who are interacting with FreeBSD and contributing their changes entirely through a Git world, but don't want to learn Subversion and continue working in that world. What does that mean for our community? Where would we go from there? I think this kind of is just a summary of points I've talked about. But so in the short term, I believe we need to make sure that our SVN to Git mirror is reproducible, is stable, and is monitored and available. We need to solve the pull request questions, and then my suggestion here is that we next start prototyping some feature or something like that. We use a Git primary focus for some development, basically act as a downstream project for some small development. And so that way we can experiment with different, for example, the vendor branch strategy. We can experiment with different ways of doing that and see how things will work, and then be able to build up some experience so that we can answer a lot of the questions that we will have in deciding whether we would switch to a Git primary world.
So you mentioned, or it's been alluded several times to, that there's some type of problem with the current mirror on GitHub, and I was hoping you could get into that a little bit.
So the content is consistent. There is some metadata that is broken in the history.
I can give specifics if you actually want to know. We can talk about that over lunch if you want.
Yeah, over lunch.
Yeah.
Basically, at one point where we did a repo compression.
Over lunch. Short story.
So
It has to do with SVN being copied wrong.
it's relatively trivial.
But we're going to stop.